Marcus had always known the streets. They were his world, his reality. But even the familiar rhythm of his daily walk home from school couldn't drown out the nervous energy creeping into his chest. The sounds of his shoes tapping against the pavement felt louder today, each echo bouncing off the concrete like a ticking clock. The day had been long, and the atmosphere heavy with a sense of foreboding, but nothing could prepare him for what happened next. The streetlights flickered on as he made his way down the usual path, the neighborhood still bustling, but somehow colder. He didn't mind the usual side glances, the unspoken judgments. After all, they'd always been there, part of the background noise of his life. But tonight, there was something different. As he rounded the corner, he saw the black and white police car parked at the end of the block, its headlights cutting through the fading daylight. Marcus stopped in his tracks. The officers inside were watching him, their eyes unblinking, like predators waiting for the right moment. He tried to shake the unease in his gut, to keep walking, but something about the scene felt too deliberate, too calculated. The car idled for a moment longer than usual, the officers inside exchanging glances. He knew what was coming. Marcus had been stopped by the police before, but this time there was no avoiding the inevitable. One of the officers, a tall man with a sharp jaw and cold eyes, stepped out of the car. He approached Marcus without hesitation, his boots pounding the pavement, every step heavy with authority. Marcus stiffened, trying to steady his breathing. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, his disability, the stutter that had plagued him since he was a child, threatened to rise in his throat. His mouth felt dry. He'd fought so hard to be taken seriously, to prove that his voice mattered. But now, in the face of this officer, he was unsure if he could even speak. "Hey there, boy," the officer said, his tone condescending, like he already knew everything there was to know about Marcus without having to ask. The officer's words rang in his ears like a drumbeat, each syllable dripping with contempt. "What's a kid like you doing out here alone?" Marcus tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat, tangled in the familiar knots of his speech disability. The officer leaned in closer, a smirk creeping across his face. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" The laughter that followed sent a chill through Marcus's spine. This wasn't just casual questioning. This was something deeper. The officer was mocking him, mocking his speech, mocking the very thing that made him different, the thing that had always made him feel like he didn't belong. He tried again, forcing the words out, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm just heading home," Marcus managed, his voice trembling. The officer didn't care. He stood there, towering over Marcus, looking down at him like a judge, like a predator. "I don't think I asked you for your life story, kid," he sneered. "Just get out of here before you make me change my mind." The officer's eyes gleamed with amusement, as if this small defenseless kid was nothing more than an inconvenience. Marcus took a step back, trying to escape the weight of the officer's gaze, trying to push past the sting of humiliation. But the officer wasn't done yet. With a sudden movement, the officer reached out and grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, his grip tight and unyielding. Marcus flinched, feeling a rush of heat to his face. He was being treated like an animal. No, worse than that. Like he was invisible. Like he didn't matter. Before he could pull away, the officer spoke again, his voice laced with mockery. "What's the matter, huh? Can't even talk right?" He chuckled to himself. "Maybe you should learn how to speak properly before you go around trying to be someone important. Nobody wants to hear your pathetic speech anyway." The words stung, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. But Marcus didn't say anything. He couldn't. Every attempt to speak felt like it would choke him, like the words would betray him and leave him broken in front of this man. He tried to hold on to his dignity, but it was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Suddenly, a voice broke through the tension. A woman, a lawyer, approached from the distance. She was older, confident, with an air of authority that immediately demanded attention. She wasn't supposed to be there, not on this street, not at this moment, but she was. And when she spoke, it was like a thunderclap in the silence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes locked on the officer. The officer hesitated for just a moment, then turned, momentarily taken aback by her presence. Marcus could see the shift in the officer's posture, from smug to defensive. "I'm just handling some business here," the officer muttered, clearly uncomfortable. The woman didn't let up. "It looks like you're harassing a kid who's just trying to get home. You need to let him go." The officer's face twisted with disdain, clearly unused to being challenged. "This doesn't concern you, lady," he growled. But the woman stood her ground. "It concerns me when people like you abuse their power to mock someone for something they can't control. It concerns me when you take advantage of someone who can't defend themselves. You should be ashamed of yourself." Her voice was calm, controlled, but every word struck with precision, like a knife cutting through the officer's bravado. For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. He just stood there, fists clenched, his expression changing from irritation to confusion to something else, something deeper, something he hadn't expected. The woman's presence, her words, her unwavering stance, had rattled him. It was the first time anyone had spoken back to him like that in a long time. It was the first time anyone had stood up for Marcus. And just for a moment, Marcus felt like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. But the moment passed quickly. The officer straightened his posture, and with a final sneer, he released Marcus, shoving him away with one last contemptuous glance. "You're lucky I don't have time for this," he muttered, before turning and walking back to his patrol car. Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He was still shaken, still humiliated, but something had changed in him. The officer had treated him like dirt, but the woman, this stranger, had shown him something he had never seen before. She had shown him that there were people out there who would stand up for him, people who would fight for what was right, even when it seemed like the whole world was against him. As she walked toward him, Marcus stood taller. His heart was still racing, but there was a spark of hope now, a tiny glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The belief that things could change, that maybe, just maybe, the world would finally start to listen. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. He might not have the power to change the world on his own, but with people like her, with people who weren't afraid to speak up, maybe he wouldn't have to. The fight was just beginning, but Marcus was ready. Marcus barely slept that night. His mind kept replaying the events from earlier, the mocking officer, his cruel words, the way the whole world seemed to be against him. He could still hear the laughter, the way his disability was twisted into something that made him less of a person in the officer's eyes. It wasn't the first time, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the anger that burned in his chest, or the shame that wrapped itself around his heart. It was worse this time because it wasn't just one person, it was the entire system, the weight of it pressing down on him, reminding him that he would always be a target. The next morning, the heaviness in Marcus's chest didn't lift. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting to happen. As he walked to school, the streets seemed colder than usual. It was as if the shadows themselves were watching him, waiting for the right moment to close in. He tried to push the thought out of his mind, focusing on the rhythm of his steps, the sound of his shoes against the sidewalk, but every person he passed seemed to carry a quiet judgment in their eyes. The way they looked at him, the way they ignored him. He wasn't a person to them. He was a statistic, an obstacle, something they were told to be afraid of. And it burned. At school, Marcus sat in the back of the classroom, his head down, doing everything he could to make himself invisible. He wasn't like the others. His speech disability, his constant struggle to get words out without stuttering, had earned him a reputation. Kids didn't understand, or worse, didn't care to understand. They saw the stutter, heard the hesitation in his voice, and used it as fuel for their cruelty. They made fun of him behind his back, in the hallways, even in class. It didn't matter. He had learned to ignore them. He had to, or at least he tried. But the damage was done. Every laugh, every snide comment, chipped away at his spirit. The bell rang for lunch, and as usual, Marcus headed to the cafeteria, keeping his head low. He didn't sit with anyone. There was always an empty seat at his table, one that he had made for himself. He ate quickly, trying to get through the meal without drawing attention. But as he picked up his tray, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. His heart sank as he turned to see a group of students, laughing and talking, their eyes fixed on him with that familiar, mocking gleam. "Hey, Marcus," one of them called out, a boy who had never once bothered to learn his name. "Got something on your mind? Or are you too busy stuttering your way through lunch?" The others laughed, the sound grating against Marcus's already fragile nerves. He clenched his fists, his stomach tightening with anger and humiliation. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth felt dry, his throat tight. Every time he tried to speak, his disability seemed to trap him in a cage, locking him in place while the world moved on, ignoring him, laughing at him. He turned away, his face burning with shame, and walked quickly to the nearest exit. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face, and he felt a wave of relief. But the moment he stepped off the school grounds, he saw them again, the police car, the same one, the officer from last night, the one who had made his life a living hell with his cruel words, was leaning against it, his arms crossed, waiting. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisted with a mix of fear and fury. He didn't know what to expect this time. Was this going to be another confrontation? Was he going to be mocked again, belittled and humiliated in front of the world? Was he going to be made to feel small, less than human, by someone who was supposed to protect him? The officer straightened as Marcus approached, a look of amusement spreading across his face. Well, look who's back," the officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought I told you to stay out of trouble. Guess you don't listen too well, huh?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His chest was tight, his breath shallow. Every part of him wanted to stand tall, to scream at this man, to tell him that he wasn't going to let him get away with this. But the words wouldn't come. The officer took a step forward, towering over him. "You know, you might want to get that speech thing looked at," he said, sneering. "If you don't fix it, people are just going to keep laughing at you. You'll never amount to anything. Just another dumb kid who thinks he's something special. Look at you. Pathetic." The words were like daggers. They cut deep. Marcus felt the weight of them, each insult digging into him like a fresh wound. He wanted to cry. He wanted to collapse right there and just disappear. But then, something inside him snapped. This wasn't right. This wasn't just him being weak. This was something much bigger. This was the world telling him he wasn't good enough, that he was less than everyone else because of the way he spoke, because of the way he looked, because of the color of his skin. "Shut up," Marcus finally said, his voice shaky but determined. "Just shut up." The officer looked at him, taken aback for a moment. Then he laughed. "Oh, so now you're talking back? You think that's going to get you anywhere? You think anyone cares about what you have to say?" Marcus felt his fists clench, the anger surging through him like a tidal wave. "You don't get it," he said, his voice rising. "You don't get to tell me who I am. I'm not the joke here. You are." For a split second, the officer's expression faltered. But then he sneered again, this time with even more venom. "You're nothing but trouble. Just another kid who thinks he's better than the system. You'll never make it out of this place, Marcus. Not with that speech, not with that attitude." Marcus felt a rush of heat, a deep, guttural anger that shook him to his core. But as the officer stepped back, his hands in his pockets, the weight of what was happening hit him. He realized then that this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that treated him like less, that turned his pain into a joke, that made him feel worthless every single day. The officer turned away, his back to Marcus as he got into the car and drove off, the engine roaring down the street. But Marcus stood there, trembling with the realization that this fight wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about everything. The system that allowed this to happen, the world that let people like him be destroyed without a second thought. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt the full weight of his anger. He wasn't just fighting to prove his worth to anyone else. He was fighting to prove it to himself. He wasn't just going to be another name, another statistic. He would fight for his dignity, for his future. And this fight, it was just beginning. The days after Marcus's run-in with the officer were a blur. He kept his head down at school, trying to avoid the gaze of his peers and the oppressive weight of his own anger. Each day felt like a battle between the desire to be invisible and the overwhelming urge to fight back, to scream at the world that he was more than just a target. But as much as he tried to block it out, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something dark that was bound to explode. The atmosphere at school had shifted. It wasn't just the kids anymore, it was the teachers too, their eyes lingering on him a moment too long, their whispers just barely audible. He knew what they thought. He wasn't the first black kid to walk through those halls. He wasn't the first to face the weight of judgment, the weight of a system that was designed to see him as less. But it didn't make it any easier. The worst part was how the officer's words echoed in his mind. He had been called pathetic by someone who had sworn to protect him. He had been told he would never amount to anything, mocked not just for his speech, but for who he was, for the color of his skin. And every time he tried to speak, the memories flooded back. The officer's taunts, the cruel laughter, the way Marcus had felt so small, so insignificant. He could still hear the officer's voice in his head. "You'll never make it out of this place, Marcus. Not with that speech, not with that attitude." But there was a shift happening inside him, an anger that had been building for years, finally starting to break free. He wasn't going to be a silent victim anymore. He wasn't going to let them keep making him feel less than. The fight was no longer just about his disability. It was about his very existence, about showing the world that he mattered. The opportunity for that fight came sooner than he expected. It was a week after the confrontation with the officer when Marcus received a call from his lawyer. She was the one who had spoken up for him that day, the woman who had made the officer hesitate. She had been following Marcus's case closely, and now she needed him. "Marcus, they're bringing you in for questioning," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You've been accused of something you didn't do, and they want to put you on trial for it. They'll use anything they can to tear you apart. I need you to stay calm, stay focused. You have a chance here, but they will try to break you." The words hit him like a slap. A trial? For something he didn't even do? The very thought made his blood boil. But the idea of the system turning its gaze back on him, accusing him of being a criminal, filled him with an intense dread. The officer who had humiliated him now seemed to have all the power, and Marcus was just another pawn in their game. The lawyer's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "I know this is hard, but you have to stay strong. You're not alone in this. We'll fight, but you need to be ready for what's coming." Marcus hung up the phone and sat in his room for a long time. He thought about the officer, about the way he had treated him, about the way the world seemed to view him as an easy target. And then he thought about his mom, about how she'd always told him to stand tall, to never let anyone make him feel inferior. But it was hard. So hard when the system itself was built to see him as less. The day of the hearing arrived, and Marcus could barely bring himself to look in the mirror. He had practiced his speech for days, trying to find the strength to speak without being laughed at, to speak without feeling that crushing weight of shame. But the closer he got to the courtroom, the more his hands shook. When he walked into the building, the cold walls and sterile air felt suffocating. He was led into the courtroom, the place where his fate would be decided, and his eyes instantly went to the officer, the one who had made him feel less than human. He was sitting on the other side, his smug expression never wavering. The officer was surrounded by a group of lawyers, all sharp suits and sharp words, ready to twist the truth to fit their narrative. Marcus stood in front of the judge, his palms sweating, his heart thundering in his chest. The weight of the moment was unbearable. The prosecutor started, speaking quickly, his words designed to paint Marcus as a danger, a menace to society. The officer's words were twisted again, the speech impediment, the stutter, all made to sound like lies, like an excuse for his actions. The words came at him like a storm, each one heavier than the last. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "this young man, Marcus, is clearly nothing more than a liability to society. He's caused trouble before, and now we have clear evidence that he's continuing his path of defiance. It's clear that his attitude, his inability to speak without hesitation, makes him dangerous." Every word stung like a slap. The prosecutor's words weren't about justice. They were about control. They were about taking everything Marcus had worked for, everything he was, and turning it into something criminal. His disability was a weapon now, used against him to paint him as less than, a threat to be neutralized. As the prosecutor finished speaking, Marcus felt the tightness in his chest, the heaviness of the air around him. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him. And then, when it was his turn to speak, the words wouldn't come. They were stuck, lodged in his throat. He tried to speak, but his stutter got the best of him. The room filled with a collective sigh of impatience. Even though it was clear what was happening, even though he was trying with every fiber of his being to push through the fear, the system was not interested in hearing him. The laughter started again. The officer, from across the room, let out a low chuckle. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It was the same laugh he had given Marcus that night on the street. The same laugh that had broken him. But this time, something in Marcus snapped. He stood taller, fighting against the stutter, fighting against the fear. He wasn't going to let them laugh at him anymore. I didn't do anything wrong, Marcus managed to say, his voice steady despite the stutter. I'm not the criminal. You don't get to judge me. You don't get to tell me who I am. The officer's smug face faltered for just a moment. The defense lawyer who had been prepared to speak for the officer was silenced, unsure of how to respond to Marcus's defiance. For the first time in the entire trial, Marcus felt like he was finally being heard. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't flawless. But it was enough. And just like that, the first crack in the system appeared. The battle wasn't over, but Marcus knew something now that he hadn't known before. The power was in his hands. They couldn't take his voice anymore. They couldn't break him. This was only the beginning. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to know where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've experienced anything similar in your own life. Your thoughts and experiences are incredibly important to us. If you're enjoying these stories, please don't forget to subscribe and share your feedback in the comments below. Now, let's continue. The courtroom had become a battlefield, but Marcus was no longer fighting just for himself. He was fighting for every black person who had been denied a voice, every disabled person who had been mocked for things they couldn't control. The mocking laughter from the officer still echoed in his mind, but now it was different. It no longer had the power to break him. Instead, it fueled the fire inside him, driving him to push harder, to expose the ugly truth of the system that had tried to crush him and so many others like him. The trial continued, the atmosphere thick with tension, as the officers and their lawyers did everything they could to paint Marcus as a threat, as a criminal who didn't belong. Every time he took the stand, they made him relive the pain of that moment, twisting his words, using his disability against him to undermine his credibility. They painted him as the villain in his own story, reducing him to nothing more than a stereotype, a problem that needed to be dealt with. The officer who had harassed Marcus on the street stood tall in the courtroom, his arrogance and privilege shining through in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself. He never once looked at Marcus like he was an equal. He only saw him as an obstacle, as someone beneath him who didn't deserve to be treated with respect. Every word he spoke was designed to tear Marcus down, to make him feel small. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officer said, his voice dripping with contempt, "we're dealing with a troubled individual here, a young man who clearly has issues. His disability makes it difficult for him to even hold a conversation, let alone understand authority. His inability to speak properly shows a lack of discipline, a lack of respect. We're not just dealing with a child who doesn't know his place, we're dealing with someone who refuses to accept the truth." The officer's words rang through the courtroom, and Marcus could feel the weight of them pressing down on him, suffocating. He had tried so hard, for so long, to prove to the world that he was more than his disability, more than the color of his skin. But no matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, there were always people who saw him as less. People like this officer, who used every tool at his disposal, his power, his privilege, his ignorance, to crush him. But Marcus wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The defense attorney, the one who had been standing by Marcus's side since the beginning, stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. His presence was commanding, a stark contrast to the smug officer who had tried to belittle Marcus at every turn. The defense lawyer's voice was steady and firm as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we're seeing here is not a case of justice being served. This is a case of a young man a disabled black child, being victimized by a system that has always sought to make him invisible. The officer who has testified against Marcus today has not only attacked him for something he cannot control, but he has also perpetuated the cycle of racism and discrimination that continues to plague this country. The question before you is not whether Marcus is guilty. The question is whether you will stand by and allow the system to continue treating him and people like him as less than human. Marcus could feel the shift in the room. The words of his lawyer, the truth that had been hidden for so long, were starting to resonate with the jury. The room was no longer as cold, no longer as suffocating. It was like the walls were starting to crack, like the truth was finally breaking through the layers of lies that had been built to protect those in power. But the officer wasn't done. He still had one more card to play, and he wasn't going to let Marcus off that easily. As the officer took the stand once more, he looked directly at Marcus, his eyes narrowing in disdain. You think you can stand there and pretend that this is about justice? You think you can tell these people that you're the victim? His voice dripped with mockery, each word calculated to make Marcus feel small again. You're nothing more than a scared little boy trying to get attention, and you think you can change the system with your stuttering and your pathetic excuses. The officer's words stung like venom, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He had lived it. The racism, the mockery, the dehumanization. It wasn't new. What was new, what was different this time, was the fire that had been lit inside him. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. You don't get it, Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion. You think you're better than me because you wear a uniform. You think your words matter more than mine because you have power. But you're wrong. You're wrong about me, and you're wrong about people like me. He took a deep breath, fighting back the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. I'm not just some kid with a disability. I'm a person. I have a voice, and I won't let you or anyone else silence me anymore. The room went silent. The officer's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Marcus saw the officer hesitate. The cracks were showing. The system was buckling under the weight of Marcus's truth, but the officer wasn't ready to give up. With a final venomous glare, he looked at the jury and said, "This kid is a threat to everything we've worked for. He doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong anywhere." Marcus's heart sank. But then the defense lawyer stood again, his words like a hammer striking a nail into place. "Don't you see?" the lawyer said, his voice calm but powerful. "This is exactly the point. This officer, this system, they are the ones who make people like Marcus feel like they don't belong. They are the ones who try to silence the voices of those who have been beaten down for so long. But today, we're going to make sure that Marcus's voice is heard." The jury shifted, their eyes no longer as cold, no longer as distant. For the first time, Marcus could see the seeds of doubt taking root in their minds. The officer's confidence was fading, the air in the room charged with the promise of change. The courtroom felt like a battleground now, and Marcus was finally standing tall, not as the broken boy the officer had mocked, but as a man who had found his voice. The officer had underestimated him. They all had. The truth had always been there, hidden beneath the weight of silence. But now, it was undeniable, and Marcus was ready to fight for it, for himself, for his future, and for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. The trial wasn't over, but the fight had only just begun. The days after Marcus's testimony were some of the hardest he'd ever faced. The trial had shifted. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just another victim, just another face to be dismissed, erased. The weight of the fight ahead, however, was far heavier than he anticipated. The courtroom, filled with tension and doubt, had become his battlefield. But now it felt like the real battle was happening within himself. His heart pounded each time he stepped inside, his mind full of questions, doubts, and fears. The officer's face, sneering at him from across the courtroom, haunted Marcus at night. The officer had succeeded in making him feel weak, vulnerable, unworthy of respect. That officer had looked at Marcus, a teenager with a speech disability, and decided that he wasn't worth listening to. His presence was more than just oppressive. It was a reflection of every single moment Marcus had faced in his life. The moments when he had been dismissed because of his disability. The moments when the world told him he wasn't enough because of the color of his skin. That officer had turned it all into a weapon, and in that moment, Marcus had been the target. But as the trial progressed, Marcus found that the rage he had bottled up for so long was beginning to surface. It wasn't just the officer's words anymore. It was the entire system, the generations of prejudice, the endless cycle of racism and dehumanization that never seemed to end. The courtroom, a place that was supposed to offer justice, had become a reflection of everything wrong with the world. The law wasn't blind. It was selective. It was blind when it came to people like Marcus. But when it came to people like the officer, it turned a blind eye to their wrongdoings, their unchecked power. Each day in the courtroom felt like Marcus was trapped in a never-ending cycle of humiliation. The prosecutor had no interest in the truth. His goal was to make Marcus look like a liar, a criminal, someone who had earned his punishment simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Every word he spoke was designed to minimize Marcus's credibility, to make him seem like he was exaggerating, like he wasn't worthy of being believed. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features, stood across from Marcus as he crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "Isn't it true, Marcus, that you've been in trouble before? Isn't it true that you've had run-ins with the police in the past?" His voice was smooth, calculated. Every word dripped with disdain. Marcus clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the way the prosecutor's words sliced through him. He knew what was coming. He had been through this before. The same questions, the same attacks on his character. They were trying to paint him as a problem, as someone who didn't belong, as someone who deserved to be silenced. The only thing that was different now was the woman, his lawyer, who stood behind him, ready to fight for the truth. "I've had encounters with the police before," Marcus said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of those memories. "But none of those times were like this. None of those times were because of who I am. They were because of how I was treated." The prosecutor smirked, and the jury shifted in their seats. "Isn't that just your way of deflecting the truth? You have a disability, Marcus. You can't even speak without hesitation. Isn't that why you've been treated the way you have? Isn't that why people don't take you seriously?" Marcus felt the room close in on him. His hands began to shake, but he clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay in control. The prosecutor had hit him where it hurt most. The stutter, the disability he had worked so hard to overcome, was being used as the reason for his humiliation. It wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he had fought for. Every moment he had spent trying to prove that he wasn't just his disability, that he was more than the limitations society placed on him, was being torn apart in front of everyone. "Stop," Marcus finally said, his voice breaking through the prosecutor's onslaught. "You don't get to define me. You don't get to tell me what my life is worth. I'm more than what you see. I'm more than the words I can or can't say. You don't understand what it's like to be seen as less, to be looked at like I'm invisible, just because of how I speak or what I look like." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. "You don't understand what it's like to be treated like I don't matter." The courtroom was silent for a moment. The prosecutor faltered, but quickly recovered, moving away from Marcus, as if he were somehow toxic. But Marcus didn't care anymore. The truth had spilled out of him, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time in his life, he felt like the truth mattered. He wasn't going to let them twist it. He wasn't going to let them break him. As the trial continued, the officer's testimony came next. The man who had mocked Marcus, who had harassed him, was called to the stand. The officer stood tall, his uniform immaculate, his face cold and unfeeling. He gave his version of events, twisting every word to make it seem like Marcus was the instigator, like Marcus had been the one to escalate the situation. But the more he spoke, the more the cracks in his story began to show. "I was just doing my job," the officer said, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. "I saw him on the street and he looked suspicious. I tried to question him, and that's when he got defensive. I had no choice but to arrest him." Marcus clenched his jaw as the officer continued, each word a lie, each sentence designed to paint him as a criminal. He could feel the anger rising inside him again, but this time, it wasn't just rage, it was a quiet resolve. He wasn't going to let this man get away with it. Not this time. His lawyer, the woman who had been his ally from the beginning, stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like to point out that the officer's version of events is riddled with inconsistencies. Marcus was simply walking home, a basic right that we all have. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a threat. He was a young man who was harassed because of his disability and the color of his skin." The officer shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't respond. His smugness was starting to crack. The defense attorney continued, "This isn't about a single encounter. This is about a pattern of behavior. This is about a system that is more than willing to destroy someone like Marcus because they don't fit into the mold of what society thinks they should be." The officer, his face flushed with embarrassment, looked at the jury. His expression was defensive, but Marcus could see the truth in the lawyer's words. The officer was no longer the confident man who had stood tall in the beginning. Now, he was a man trying to cover his tracks, to hide the truth behind his lies. Marcus stood, his chest rising and falling with every breath. The world had always tried to silence him, to make him feel small, but now, in this moment, he realized something. His voice mattered, his life mattered, and as long as he had the truth on his side, no one could take that away from him. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When they returned, the verdict was clear, not guilty. The officer's lies had been exposed. Marcus had been vindicated. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But the fight wasn't over. It wasn't about one victory. It was about the larger battle. The battle against a system that continued to dehumanize him and others like him. The battle for his dignity. The battle to make sure that no one else would ever be made to feel the way he had. Marcus walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. He wasn't done. This was only the beginning. In the weeks following the trial, Marcus thought things might start to feel different. The victory, the small yet significant win in the courtroom, had been a spark, a reminder that there was still hope, still a chance to fight against the forces that had once made him feel powerless. But the reality was harsher than he'd expected. While the verdict had been a win, the victory felt hollow. There were no celebrations, no cheers in the streets. There was only the quiet weight of knowing that this one case was only a small part of a much larger battle. A battle against a system that had spent years working to silence people like him. When Marcus walked through the streets now, he noticed something different. The looks. They weren't as innocent as they once had been. People looked at him with a mixture of judgment and resentment, as if they were silently questioning how he could have fought back, how he could have stood up against the very system that had been designed to keep him in his place. The officer from the trial, the one who had mocked his speech, the one who had made him feel small, had been forced to step down. But that didn't mean the world had changed. The scars, both physical and emotional, were still there, lingering in the corners of his mind. He couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of those stares, those whispered comments. He couldn't go to school without hearing the undercurrent of laughter as his classmates imitated his stutter behind his back. He had won the battle, but the war was still ongoing, and for every small victory, there were 100 reminders of how much further he had to go. Marcus spent more and more time alone in his room, trying to block out the noise of the world. The isolation felt suffocating, but he wasn't sure where else to turn. He knew his mother worried about him. She could see how the victory had weighed on him, how it hadn't fixed the deeper issues he faced. She could see how he'd changed, how the anger had started to simmer beneath the surface, how it had become harder for him to smile, to feel like things would ever truly get better. She tried to comfort him, to tell him that change was coming, that they had made a difference. But Marcus wasn't sure anymore. How could he be? At school, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just behind his back anymore. Some of the kids started confronting him, calling him names, making jokes about him. It wasn't just his speech anymore. It was everything about him, the way he looked, the way he held himself. They said he was too much, too angry, too defiant, too unwilling to accept what was happening around him. One day, as he walked into the school hallway, he saw a group of students laughing in a circle. As he approached, they turned and stared at him. their eyes filled with disdain. "Well, look who's finally showing up," one of the girls said, her voice sharp with contempt. "What? Did you think just because you won a trial, you were some kind of hero?" Another one of the boys laughed. "Yeah, you're not special, Marcus. You're just some kid with a disability, acting like the whole world owes you something." Marcus stopped in his tracks. His heart raced, his stomach twisted with anger. He knew they were testing him, pushing him, trying to get a reaction. And for a moment, just a moment, he considered walking away. It would be easier. But the years of being silenced, of being reduced to nothing, bubbled to the surface. "I'm not here for your approval," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "And I don't need your approval to be somebody." The group of students exchanged glances, their laughter dying down as they realized he wasn't going to back down. The girl who had spoken first narrowed her eyes. "You think you can talk back now? After all the trouble you caused? You're just a freak, Marcus. No one cares about your little victory. The world still sees you for what you are." Her words struck him like a slap in the face. The world still saw him as a problem, a freak, someone who didn't belong. "Maybe you're right," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Maybe I'm nothing to you, but I'm not going to let you define me. Not anymore." He turned away and walked down the hall, ignoring the laughter that followed him, the whispered insults, the anger that had built inside him, the shame, the humiliation. It all mixed together, boiling over as he made his way to his next class. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't just about him. This wasn't just a battle for his dignity. It was a battle for everyone who had been told they didn't matter, for everyone who had been pushed aside and made invisible. It was a battle he couldn't ignore. When Marcus got home that evening, his mother could tell something was wrong. She was always good at reading him, at seeing when the weight of the world was starting to crush him. She sat with him at the kitchen table, her eyes soft with concern. "I heard what happened at school today," she said gently. "I know it's hard, Marcus, but you can't let them get to you. You're stronger than they think." Marcus stared at the table, his mind racing. "I'm tired, Mom," he admitted. "I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of being the one who has to prove that I'm worth something. I thought I was doing the right thing, but it's not enough. It's never enough." His mother reached across the table and took his hand. "I know you're tired. I see it in your eyes, but that's why we fight, Marcus. Because if we don't, nothing will ever change. They're trying to make you believe you're less than, but you are more. You are worthy of every opportunity, every ounce of respect, and every chance to speak your truth. Don't let them take that from you." Her words, though comforting, didn't ease the storm inside him. He had heard them before. His mother had always been his rock, always reminding him that he mattered. But the world didn't see him the way she did. The world saw him as a problem, as a threat. And no matter how many victories he won, no matter how much he fought, the world kept reminding him of the same thing. He didn't belong. As the days passed, Marcus continued to fight, but the fight was changing. It wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. It wasn't just about the officers or the school bullies. It was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about a system that had been built to suppress him and so many others like him. A system that didn't care about his voice, didn't care about his truth. But Marcus was done with being quiet. He was done with being invisible. The world might have tried to silence him, might have tried to make him feel like he didn't matter. But he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The battle was far from over. But Marcus was beginning to understand something. The more they tried to break him, the stronger he became. And the day would come when the world would have to listen. He wouldn't stop fighting until they did. Marcus had been pushed to the limit. His life stretched thin with every insult, every mockery, every unfair judgment that came his way. But now, more than ever, he could feel the weight of it all beginning to shift. He was no longer the kid who simply accepted the cruelty around him. No, the fight that had started in that courtroom, in front of a jury of strangers, was now burning brighter inside him, growing stronger with every day. It wasn't just the victory of the trial that had changed him. It was the realization that he had a voice that couldn't be silenced. Not by the officer who had mocked him, not by the school bullies, not by the system that tried to strip him of his dignity. But the fight was far from over. It was a fight that wouldn't end in the courtroom. It wasn't something that could be won with one victory or one powerful speech. No, this was a battle that Marcus had to face every single day. It was the battle of existence, of survival, of being able to walk through a world that told him over and over again that he didn't belong. The tension had been building for weeks. Every day felt like a tug of war between Marcus and the world around him. At school, he was still the target of snide remarks and cruel jabs, though they were no longer just whispers in the hallways. Some of the kids were bolder now. They saw him as a threat, someone who had dared to speak out, dared to challenge them. The officer's mocking words still echoed in his mind, and the judgment from his peers only made things worse. The stares were worse now, the whispers were louder, but it wasn't just the kids at school. It was the entire system that surrounded him, one that had been designed to ignore him, to make him invisible. On one particularly hot afternoon, as Marcus was walking home from school, he was stopped by a group of boys he had known since elementary school. They were the same ones who had made fun of him in the past, the ones who had always treated him like he didn't belong. But today, they weren't just laughing behind his back. No, today, they were ready to confront him, to drag him back into the place where they thought he belonged. "Hey, Marcus," one of them called, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're some kind of hero now, huh? You think just because you got a few lucky breaks, you can walk around here acting like you matter?" Marcus didn't stop walking. He had learned long ago that if he ignored them, they would eventually lose interest. But this time, the taunting continued. The boy stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "What's the matter, huh?" the boy sneered. "Cat got your tongue. I thought you'd have something to say now that you've been in the news. You must feel so special, huh? All those people cheering for you. They don't know the truth about you. They don't know what you really are." Marcus stood still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The heat of the day pressed down on him, making everything feel suffocating. But the anger in his chest was even worse. He wasn't afraid anymore. But the humiliation that had followed him for years, the constant belittling, the constant dehumanization, was starting to boil over. "I'm not here for you," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "I don't need to prove anything to you. You don't get to decide who I am." The boy laughed. "You're just a joke, Marcus. A kid who can't even talk right. You think that makes you better than us? You think that gives you the right to act like you're something special?" His voice was harsh, full of venom. "You're not special. You're just a freak, and the whole world's going to see that." The words stung, but they didn't break Marcus. No, they only fueled the fire inside him, a fire that had been building for years, a fire that was starting to crack the walls of his own silence. The boy was just another part of the system that had tried to break him, another face in a crowd of people who thought they had the right to control him. Marcus took a deep breath. "You don't get it," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You don't get to tell me who I am. You don't get to decide what I can do or who I can be. I'm not your joke. And I'm not going to let you make me feel small anymore." The boy's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to lash out. But Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He stood his ground, ready for whatever was coming, ready to finally fight back. But before the boy could say anything else, a voice called out from behind them. It was the same woman from the courtroom, the lawyer who had stood up for him, the one who had made the officer freeze in his tracks. She was walking down the street, a firm look on her face as she approached the group of boys. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but commanding. The boys looked at her, taken aback by her presence. They had been used to getting away with this kind of behavior, used to people backing down when they faced a threat. But this woman wasn't backing down. She wasn't afraid of them. And for the first time, Marcus realized just how much power someone could have when they stood up for what was right. The boys mumbled something and walked away, their confidence shattered by the sudden appearance of someone who wasn't afraid to challenge them. Marcus watched as they retreated, their heads lowered, their swagger gone. The lawyer turned to Marcus, her eyes soft with understanding. "Are you all right?" she asked. Marcus nodded, though his heart was still racing. I'm fine, he said, but his voice was thick with emotion. I'm just tired of it all, tired of the way they see me, tired of being told I don't matter. The lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder. I know, but you have something they'll never have. You have the truth. You have your voice, and as long as you keep fighting, they can't take that away from you. Marcus looked at her, his throat tight with emotion. She was right. He had been fighting his whole life to be seen, to be heard, and now he was starting to understand that the fight wasn't just about winning in court or silencing the people who mocked him. The real fight was about changing the world, changing the system that had been designed to make people like him feel invisible. As the lawyer walked away, Marcus stood there for a moment, taking in the weight of what had just happened. The street was quiet again, the world moving around him as it always did. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't invisible anymore. He had fought back, and he had been heard. The battle wasn't over, far from it, but Marcus knew now that he wasn't alone. There were people who saw him, people who were willing to stand up for him, to fight for what was right. The fight had only just begun, but he was ready. He was ready to face whatever came next, and no one, no matter how much power they had, would ever make him feel small again. The silence was breaking, and Marcus was finally finding his voice. The days following the confrontation with the group of boys felt like a strange, exhausting blend of relief and frustration. The brief moment of support from the lawyer had given Marcus a temporary sense of hope, but it was fleeting. The world hadn't changed overnight. The whispers in the hallways, the sideways glances, the quiet judgments, they hadn't stopped, and no matter how many times he'd told himself that he was more than what the world saw, the sting of those words, those assumptions, was hard to shake. Each morning, as Marcus walked through the school doors, it felt like a gauntlet. The hallway was filled with students who saw him as different, saw his stutter, saw his disability, and reduced him to just that. There were no sympathetic looks, no understanding glances, just mockery, just contempt. He had hoped that, after the trial, after he had stood up for himself, they would see him differently, that things would change. But they hadn't. And the worst part was that the adults weren't much better. The teachers who had witnessed his struggles, who had seen the way he fought to speak, to be heard, said nothing. It was as though they were complicit in the silence, too afraid to challenge the status quo, too afraid to break the cycle. One afternoon, during a history class, Marcus sat in the back of the room, trying to focus on the lesson. The teacher, a middle-aged man with greying hair and a permanent frown, was talking about the civil rights movement, about the struggles of people like Marcus's ancestors, the ones who had fought for freedom and equality. The words were familiar, comforting even, but today they felt hollow. The teacher spoke of progress, of change, of the brave men and women who had paved the way for people like him to have the freedom to sit in a classroom and learn. But Marcus knew the truth. Progress wasn't a straight line. It wasn't a given. It wasn't guaranteed. As the teacher droned on about Martin Luther King Jr. and the marches, the speeches, the victories, Marcus felt a familiar, gnawing frustration build inside him. The teacher's words seemed so distant from his reality. The world hadn't changed as easily as the textbooks made it seem, and when the teacher said, almost absent-mindedly, "And that's how we got to where we are today, with equality and opportunity for all," Marcus almost couldn't hold back the bitterness that rose in his throat. Equality? Opportunity? He had seen none of that. The racism was still there, alive and well, and no amount of history lessons could change the way the world saw him. No amount of speeches, of victories, could change the fact that he was still looked down on, still seen as less than. His disability, his skin color, were still the marks that determined his worth, still the chains that held him down. At that moment, Marcus snapped. He raised his hand, his palms sweating, his heart racing. The teacher looked at him, surprised. "Yes, Marcus." "With all due respect," Marcus said, the words tumbling out, "equality isn't just something that happens. It doesn't just come because we read about it in a book or because we hear nice speeches. We're still fighting for it. People like me are still fighting for it every single day. I can't sit here and pretend that everything is fine just because I'm in a classroom. It's not enough. You're teaching us about change, but nothing's changed. Not really. The room fell silent. The teacher's face flushed with discomfort, and the other students shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, unsure of how to react. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the teacher cleared his throat. "Marcus, I understand your frustration, but—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice gaining strength. You don't get to just say it's okay because you think it's over. You don't get to pretend that everything is fine when people like me are still being treated like dirt." His voice wavered with emotion. "I'm tired of it. Tired of being told I'm too sensitive, that I'm overreacting. I'm tired of hearing about how far we've come while I'm still living in a world that treats me like I'm less than." The teacher opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You can sit there and talk about history all you want, but the reality is that I'm living it. I'm living in a world where the people who should protect me are the ones hurting me." The weeks after Marcus's outburst in class felt like both a weight and a release. It was as though a dam had broken inside him. He had been holding it all in, the shame, the anger, the frustration, for so long that it had finally spilled over and he couldn't bring himself to take it back. After confronting his teacher in that way, something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just the sting of humiliation that had pushed him to speak up. It was the constant pressure of living in a world that refused to acknowledge his worth, his voice. At school, things didn't improve. If anything, they got worse. The very thing Marcus had feared had come true. His outburst had branded him as a troublemaker, as someone who couldn't take a joke or understand how things worked. The whispers behind his back turned into open conversations in the hallways. The stares became longer, more judgmental. The teacher who had been the catalyst for his outburst barely looked at him now, avoiding eye contact as if he were some contagious disease. But it wasn't just the students. It wasn't just the adults who pretended to look the other way. It was the police. The very ones who were supposed to protect him had been the ones who'd humiliated him, and it was like they had taken notice of his voice. The very officer who had mocked him during the trial had been seen hanging around the school parking lot, patrolling the area more than usual. Marcus had no doubt that the officer was watching him, keeping an eye on him, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. One afternoon, Marcus was walking home from school when he saw the familiar police car parked near his usual route. The officer was standing by the vehicle, looking at something in his hand. Marcus's heart began to race. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to endure it again. As he approached the car, the officer looked up, his cold eyes locking with Marcus's. For a split second, there was no laughter, no mocking. It was just a silent confrontation. The officer stepped forward, his boots heavy against the pavement, a smirk beginning to curl on his lips. "Well, well, look who we have here," the officer said, his voice dripping with derision. "You're getting a little too big for your britches, aren't you?" Marcus didn't respond. He wanted to scream, to tell the officer everything he'd been holding inside, to finally stand his ground. But his body betrayed him. The weight of his previous encounters, the constant reminders of his inferiority, made the words catch in his throat. The officer stepped closer, towering over him, his presence suffocating. "You think you can go around challenging people like me, huh? Think that because you got a lucky break in the courtroom, you've suddenly got the right to talk back? You're just a kid. You'll always be a kid. And you're not nearly as tough as you think you are." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, but his legs felt weak. The familiar anxiety began to rise, the fear that had been planted in him so many years ago. It was like the officer had reached into his chest and was squeezing all the air out of his lungs. The humiliation was unbearable. "You really should learn your place," the officer continued, his voice growing louder. "You're nothing but trouble. People like you don't deserve to be treated with respect. You should know your place and be grateful when people like me even acknowledge you." The officer's words pierced through Marcus like a blade. They weren't just about him, they were about everything. The years of being looked down on, the years of being treated as less than human, the years of being denied dignity simply because of his disability, because of the color of his skin. And now, Once again, this officer, this man who was supposed to protect him, was reminding him of his place in the world. "Why don't you just leave me alone?" Marcus finally said, his voice trembling. "Why do you have to keep doing this?" The officer let out a harsh laugh. "Leave you alone? Are you out of your mind? You think I'm going to let you walk around like you matter? You'll never be more than what you are, Marcus. You'll never be enough." The words hung in the air, poisonous and suffocating. Marcus took a step back, but the officer took another step forward, closing the space between them. The officer's shadow seemed to loom over him, and Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down on his chest. But this time, something inside Marcus snapped. The anger that had been building in him for years, the rage that had started to bubble to the surface after the trial, after every cruel word, every unfair encounter, finally erupted. "No!" Marcus shouted, the words finally tumbling out. "You don't get to decide who I am. You don't get to make me feel like nothing. You don't get to tell me that I'm not enough. I'm more than you could ever understand." The officer froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, Marcus could see a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. The officer wasn't used to being challenged, not in this way. He had spent his career using his power to intimidate, to break people down. But Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. "You think this is some game?" the officer sneered. "You think you can talk back to me without consequences?" Marcus stood his ground. "Maybe there's a consequence for you, but not for me. I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done being told I don't matter." The officer's face turned red with anger. "You should watch your mouth, boy," he hissed, stepping even closer. "You really think you can stand up to me? You think you can stand up to this system? You'll never win." Marcus's heart was pounding now, but he wasn't scared. He was tired of being scared. He was tired of cowering before people who thought they had power over him. The officer might have thought he could break him, might have thought that words would be enough to silence him. But Marcus knew better. He had seen through their lies. He had seen the truth. "I'm not afraid of you," Marcus said, his voice strong, clear. "And I'm not afraid of the system that lets people like you treat people like me like we don't matter. You don't control me anymore. No one does." For a moment, there was silence. The officer stood still, his breath heavy, his jaw clenched. Marcus stared at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. Finally, the officer backed away, his expression darkening. "You're making a huge mistake, kid," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking away, leaving Marcus standing there, alone on the street. Marcus watched him go, his breath still heavy in his chest, his body trembling from the intensity of the moment. The weight of the officer's words had been heavy, suffocating, but Marcus had stood up to him. He had finally found his voice, and no one could take that away from him. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but Marcus knew one thing for certain. He was done being silent. He was done letting the world define him. No matter how much they tried to tear him down, no matter how much they tried to make him feel small, he wasn't going to be silenced anymore. And from that moment on, he was going to make sure the world knew it. The weight of the world hung heavy over her as she stood in the courtroom, her legs trembling beneath the dress she wore for the first time in months. It felt foreign. Her usual jeans and t-shirt had been replaced with an outfit that her father insisted would make her look respectable. But none of it mattered now. The cameras, the eyes of the public, the whispers, none of them would make her feel any less like a target. Her father, the senator, had promised to use his influence, but as the trial approached its final moments, it was clear that the system was far more entrenched than anyone had imagined. She had hoped, she had believed, that there was a way to change things. But with every step she took, the walls of the courtroom seemed to grow higher, thicker, more suffocating. The defense attorney for the officer who had abused her was skilled, too skilled. His words flowed like honey, dripping with condescension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we are not here to discuss race. We are here to discuss actions, choices, and the duty of law enforcement to maintain order in a chaotic world." The defendant was simply doing his job, and this young lady, though clearly troubled, was caught in a situation that escalated beyond her control. He paused, turning to the jury, his expression serene. We cannot ignore the fact that she was an active participant in the disturbance. Her father clenched his fists beside her, his knuckles white. The lawyer's words were poison. It was all too familiar. The vilification of her pain, the attempt to turn her trauma into a spectacle. They painted her as the aggressor. They called her troubled, insinuating that her very existence, her very presence in the neighborhood, had been the catalyst for the brutality she had suffered. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She had expected this, the endless battle against her own truth. But what she hadn't expected was the new twist, the sudden shift in the room that left everyone breathless. Just as the judge was about to call the court to a break, the door burst open. In walked a woman, a lawyer. Her presence was undeniable. Every pair of eyes in the room followed her as she stepped forward, exuding a confidence that seemed to split the tension in the air like a blade. It wasn't just her appearance that caught everyone off guard. It was the name she carried. She was the daughter of a powerful civil rights leader, someone who had spent decades fighting against the very system that had caused so much harm to people like her. The officer who had brutalized her flinched when he saw her. His smug smile faltered for just a moment before he caught himself, but it was enough. The room noticed. The jury noticed. She approached the stand, her heels clicking against the floor, and took her place beside the prosecutor. The defense lawyer's face paled, his composure cracked, and for the first time since the trial began, he seemed unsure of himself. The room buzzed with a new kind of energy. The weight had shifted. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I represent the truth today. Not the truth of what the defense has tried to sell you, but the truth that exists beyond the lies and manipulation." She turned to the jury, her eyes locking with each of them. "You've been told that this is about a disruption and an unruly young woman. You've been told that the police were simply doing their duty. But I ask you, what duty is that? What kind of duty allows for a man to strip away the dignity of a human being simply because of the color of their skin?" The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the power of history and truth. As the lawyer continued her argument, outlining the history of systemic racism and brutality faced by countless black families, the officer's demeanor began to crack. The facade of duty and honor that he had cloaked himself in began to dissolve. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands twitching slightly. It was clear he had never expected this. But it was what happened next that no one could have predicted. The judge, who had remained passive throughout most of the trial, suddenly leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes," he called to the officer, "would you care to explain your actions?" The officer's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The confidence that had once made him so brazen began to crumble. The courtroom filled with a heavy silence as everyone waited for his answer. But there was no answer, only the sound of his labored breathing. In that moment, everything changed. The officer's bravado vanished, and the truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies and corruption began to surface. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. When they returned, the verdict was swift. Guilty. The officer was to be held accountable for his actions. The room erupted. Some cheered, some cried. But the girl, the young woman whose pain had started this all, stood motionless. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression unreadable. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. But as the gavel struck, marking the end of the trial, something inside her shifted. The battle was not over. The system that had allowed this to happen was still there, still looming. The victory was important, but it was only one small part of a much larger war. Her gaze swept across the room, her heart heavy. She had won, but the fight for justice, for true justice, was far from over. And now she was ready to fight, not just for herself, but for all the other invisible victims of a broken system. She wasn't just a daughter of a senator anymore. She was a warrior, and this was just the beginning. The final moment of the trial wasn't a celebration. It was a call to arms. And the war for change had only just begun. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you experienced racism in your life, or witnessed it. Your experiences matter to us, and we deeply value each and every one of you. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and give us a like. Your support means the world to us. Have a wonderful day ahead. And to show us you've listened until the very end, leave a comment with the phrase, "The fight for justice is never over." We can't wait to hear from you.